aiming for the dogs. There was turmoil as everyone hunted over the zips of their siren suits, hunted for torches, gas masks, and other impedimenta. Then we all struggled downstairs. We unlocked the back door, no easy matter, and made our way over some flower beds down the garden, cursing the irregularities of the route, the bad behaviour of the other dogs, the Germans, and one another. As we tumbled at last over the marrows and cabbages into the shelter, the all clear sounded, and we began tottering back. I was spellbound, but had to follow the circus, my mother later wrote in her account for me. Back to bed, and you really did not know anything about it, as you were half asleep all the time. So was I. But I do recall the illuminations of the night sky, the cold air, and a general melee.
Michael Holroyd reading from his memoir, Basil Street Blues. As a teenager, you went to Eton College, and after graduating, your father suggested that you go into the sciences, and when you were interested in writing, he was very derisive. Do you think your father ever accepted your profession as a writer?
He did more than accept it. He tried to become a writer himself. While I was struggling over my first book, he polished off, I think it was 4 unpublished novels in typescript. I remember one concerned the fate of a carbon paper organisation. There was a lot of meetings between bank managers and so on. And they were perfectly all right, but they lacked a certain glamour, I think, really. So he really had a very great difficulty after the Second World War in finding his feet, and he was very anxious on my behalf. The reason he wanted me to study the sciences is because so many of the jobs he saw were for scientists.
And did your father accept your profession as a writer?
Yes, in a way he did. I mean, he wanted me to succeed, but he would have liked me to succeed with his help, and he was unable to give me help, and that's what he found difficult.
Near the end of his life, your father told you that your mother had said to him, "We could never have had a better son." And you say this was far from the truth, but it signaled a truce over all the animosities. Where had that spirit of truce come from?
My father found it very difficult to accept money and to give praise. But he had no money, and I had to pretend that I was sort of less successful at a certain time than I was, that the car I drove down wasn't actually mine. But in the end, we came to an accommodation, and he said those words, quoting my mother. The dog was in between us, so I could hardly hear, and he couldn't get to it. And he said them in the car as we sat there apart. And then, in great embarrassment, he struggled with the door to get out of earshot, because this was not his language, but he wanted to signal something generous. He wanted to say something good. He found it very difficult, but he did it.
Hearing you describe that reminds me of when you describe the death of your mother in this book as well, where you have difficulty communicating your own feelings. Was it very hard to write about this period in their lives?
That was the most difficult period, really, the deaths of them. I mean, there are funny things even there. When my father was very ill, he sort of lost his reasoning, his mind. And I remember going to see him in the hospital, and he believed he was back in the war, and he was in the RAF, and he waved me to his side, and we looked round the ward full of people on drips and plaster of Paris and so on, and he said to me, "I don't think much of the new recruits." So there is comedy, but and particularly in my mother's case, where she had a cruel and long illness, and whatever I did, I could only help her in small things, but how important those small things are, and yet they are only small things. This was difficult, and I wish I'd been able to bring her more comfort than I did.
You write that even then, you were unable to touch her, and then you say, "I have to write that again."
Yes, I couldn't easily embrace her, and it should have been the thing I could have done at that moment. There are many reasons for it, sort of fastidiousness, and I couldn't do it. But in the book, I come out with it, and then I thought I had to write it again, so it comes twice.
To admonish yourself?
Yes, that's the atonement, if you like, again, and yes.
Margot Drabble, I'd like to talk about your new novel, The Peppered Moth. And I guess first, how much of its central character, Bessie Botchery, is your mother?
A great deal of that central character is based on my mother, on her recollections, on my memories of her, and on various documentary evidence. So it is fairly close to her.
Your parents grew up in the coal mining area of southern Yorkshire. Your mother, in a sense, doesn't sound like a typical child of working class parents. She's described as fastidious and rare.
Yes, she was always too good for her surroundings, but I think that probably wasn't all that uncommon. I think it's quite a common fantasy if you're born into a fairly ordinary house, but with ambitions. I mean, they were very clean people, as I think people in dirty areas often are, and so you begin to think you were born for something better, and that certainly was a feeling she had.
And your mother perceived education as a route to escape.
Yes, she certainly did, and she was encouraged to do that, not I think by her parents, but by where she found herself. And indeed it was absolutely correct. That is how you got out of there, was by going to grammar school and climbing the ladder.
And in a sense, you were able to leave Yorkshire via Cambridge. And there are accounts of other writers, writers such as Margaret Forster, the late Lorna Sage, have all written about being able to do that. But in the end, for your mother, education wasn't the answer. What went wrong?
Well, she belonged to the wrong generation. It wasn't her fault. She was born too early. She was born at the beginning of the last century, and she was at Cambridge. I mean, it's very exceptional to get to Cambridge from this particular background. But the late 20s, and then the Depression came, and so she couldn't get the good teaching job that she thought she ought to have got with her qualifications. Then she married, then World War II came, she went back to teach, but then the end of the war came, she lost her job because the men came back from the war. There was a whole sequence of setbacks through her career, which I don't think she perceived as setbacks, because in a way she'd been successful. She'd married an upwardly mobile, successful professional man who happened to be at school with her, but he also made good in his life. So she, in theory, was able to tell herself she'd had a successful life, but in practice, I think she did feel thwarted, that she hadn't used her education.
So you think it's much more the times than her? And because the way you describe her as well, she has these her own personal setbacks, even within her own trajectory, her own strivings.
Writing the book made me able to see her as more part of her times. I'd always thought it was her own personal difficulties, but I think it was part of her, of a whole generation. She did have personal difficulties. She did have failures of nerve, and she did have a bitterness of spirit. But again, I think that was not uncommon. I think that a great deal was asked of her to move out of this place where she was born into the places where she found herself, and she couldn't quite do it.
Your mother ended up being a housewife and mother and unhappy with her situation. What was growing up with her like for you?
She was a very difficult woman. She was quite short-tempered, and she became very depressive. But what I can't quite remember is how early these things set in, because of course when you're only 3 or 4 years old, you just take your mother as your mother, and it's only as you get older, into sort of 11, 12, that you begin to realise that your mother is not as other mothers. And she certainly became agoraphobic. She didn't like to go out very much, and she did very peculiar things which I haven't put in the book.
Why not?
Because well, I'll tell you what one of them is about. My younger sister Helen. This was really an extraordinary story, and I don't think Helen would have liked me to tell it. She doesn't mind people knowing it, but it somehow didn't fit in the book. She used to set us off to school, go to school on our own, on the bus, on public transport, when we were 5 years old. And People did that more in those days. But Helen, coming back from school, aged just 5, Sheffield, a big industrial city, went past the bus stop because she couldn't get to the exit of the bus, past the bus stop that she knew she should have got off at, and just hurled herself from this moving vehicle into the street. She nearly lost an eye. She had a tremendous graze, and in fact she broke a collarbone which they never discovered until she was in her 30s. It suddenly began to stick out. And my mother never thought there was anything odd about the fact that this little child had been travelling alone. And that's the kind of thing she did. And I sound angry now. I am angry on Helen's behalf. She shouldn't have done that. And she used to send me out to do the shopping when I was 6 or 7 because she didn't like to go to the shops. She was nervous of the shopkeepers. And I remember I would buy the loaf of bread and bring it home, and it cost 2pence halfpenny. I remember the price hanging over the 2pence and the halfpenny. And it never occurred to me that it was odd that I was doing the shopping at this age. Why wasn't she going out and doing it? She was like that at the end of her life. And by the time she was 60, 70, you could understand that she wasn't going out lugging the shopping about. But she didn't do it even when she was younger. There was something peculiar. I didn't realise how peculiar until I started looking at her when I was a mother myself and thinking, I wouldn't let my children do some of the things I was allowed to do. I know the streets were safer then, but they weren't that much safer. So in the novel I had difficulty not telling a lot of true stories that I felt weren't mine. That's Helen's story. It's not my story, it's Helen's story. I shouldn't be telling it. I don't mind telling it in conversation, but I didn't want to put it in the novel. But there were all sorts of contradictions like that in that as you get older you question more and more why she behaved in this way. Was she really agoraphobic? Was she really clinically depressed? I don't know.
Well, you say that she liked to describe herself almost boastfully as suffering from endogenous depression.
She loved that phrase, endogenous. What does it mean? I think it means depression without a reason. I think it means depression that is sort of metabolic rather than caused by a life disaster. And she finally did go and see a doctor because she became so difficult in her 50s. And it was menopausal behaviour, but of an extreme sort. She did go and see a doctor up in Newcastle, where my father was then county court judge. And this doctor gave her a lot of pills. And she did love taking pills, and she loved describing the different kinds of pills she was on for her endogenous depression. And she got a relish out of it, but I don't know if they did her any good. But she might have been worse without them. I don't know. And I was too young to work out what was going on. I mean, I was a teenager. I was depressed by her depression.
Later, and in writing this book or thinking about this book, have you been able to understand the source of her unhappiness or what might have made her happy?
I think it was frustration. It was frustration with her own life having seemed to be set so fair and then being turned back in on itself. It was the social difficulty, and if you talk to people from the north of England, this still exists. You feel you're a second-class citizen, even if you do very well. She was a woman, she was a second-class